thank you to the Geneva Campus Ministry, to the University of Iowa, and also to Trinity Episcopal Church for hosting us in this beautiful space today. I'd also like to thank the Louisville Institute and Calvin College for funding portions of this research, and I'd like to give a special call out to three fabulous research assistants of mine from Calvin, Kelly Luman, Katharine Post, and Josh Parks, who have all played a part in this. So you've probably heard the number by now. There we are. Fox News does make an appearance. 81%. According to exit polls, this is the number of white evangelicals who voted for Trump. A higher percentage, by the way, than any other recent Republican. Now, in some ways, this isn't surprising. White evangelicals tend to vote Republican. And although he didn't initially pay a lot of attention to evangelical voters, as the campaign went on, he did make some promises to them. He courted them, particularly promising Supreme Court appointments. And this was especially important to evangelicals who are primarily concerned with abortion and with religious freedom. And on this front, he has come through for them. And yet, of course, it is surprising, this strong evangelical support for Trump. How could family values conservatives, the self-professed moral majority, embrace this twice-divorced, thrice-married man who boasted of his manhood on national television, who incited violence at his rallies, and who stood accused of assaulting women? A man who stood on the stage of a Christian college in Iowa, my alma mater, no less, and bragged that he could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and not lose voters. A man who clearly struggled with basic religious literacy. Remember 2 Corinthians? And this was when he did speak of his faith, which over the course of much of the campaign was a rare occurrence. Now, a little side note, a year ago, I was working on the faith of Hillary Clinton, and as part of that project, I had compiled a massive database of nearly every speech that she had given over her political career. I was running some linguistic analysis on that with the help of Caitlin Gitchelar, another research assistant. And it was last summer that we decided to do a little comparative study. And so we compiled a data set of speeches from Trump and speeches from Clinton during the campaign. Just a small sample set, so 7 major speeches that each had given at roughly similar times during the campaign. And we ran the numbers. We discovered some interesting grammatical tendencies on the part of Donald Trump. He likes to reference himself at an extraordinary rate linguistically. And he does so often in the third person, which is also quite unusual. But I was especially interested in issues of faith. And so we did a rather simple study. We just searched for a few keywords: God, faith, and let's see, what else? Religion. And we found that in our sample set, so 7 speeches, Clinton talked about her faith 12 times. Some of those were kind of run-of-the-mill, one nation under God, God bless America, God bless you. She talks a lot about wanting to open up people's God-given potential. But on 2 occasions in these 7 speeches, she actually referenced her Methodist faith in some depth, talked about how it had shaped her and how it had shaped her approach to politics. Trump, on the other hand, said very little. While he referenced himself 850 times in 7 speeches, he referenced God twice, both times irreverently. I'll be the greatest sorry, not that irreverently. I'll be the greatest jobs president God ever created. And in reference to Clinton's foreign policy, with an accompanying eye roll, God help us. Now, at that time, I reflected that, given their rhetoric alone, one might expect Clinton to be the more popular candidate among voters who speak of their faith or who advocate the significance of faith and values. But of course, this was not the case. Already back then, in July of 2016, 8 in 10 white evangelicals supported Trump. So back then, when I was processing this data, I was writing primarily to religious historians, and I ventured a few theories as to why this was the case. Here's what I wrote. Has an embrace of patriarchal power in the church and home situated evangelicals to look for an autocratic patriarch to lead the nation? Has a self-referential trend in contemporary Christianity blinded evangelicals to Trump's narcissism? Have deep roots in premillennialism made evangelicals more prone to demonize the other? Have Christian values long been but a veneer for racism, sexism, or xenophobia? Has Christian nationalism destroyed any semblance of Christian witness? Is this the logical culmination of corporate evangelicalism? And I kind of let those questions hang. Now, if evangelical support for Trump was a conundrum in the summer of 2016, it reached crisis stage almost exactly 1 year ago with the release of the Access Hollywood tapes. Perhaps you remember. I remember quite well because I was due to go on live television, national television in Canada, only hours after the Access Hollywood tapes were released. I was supposed to be speaking on Trump and Clinton and their linguistic style and what we might expect that evening in the second debate. And instead, I was frantically processing what we had just learned from Access Hollywood tapes. Here we had, if you recall, a presidential candidate on video bragging about assaulting women in very crude terms. Now, in the immediate aftermath, evangelical support appeared to waver, especially among a number of prominent evangelical women who denounced Trump and called on evangelicals to do likewise. But that turned out to be a momentary blip. By the time of the election, only weeks later, evangelicals had once again rallied behind the values-challenged candidate. And they were critical to his victory. How do we explain this? Now, one popular theory is that millions of evangelicals were holding their noses as they voted for Trump because they hated Hillary that much. Another theory posited that the most religious evangelicals didn't actually support Trump as much as the more nominal evangelicals. But there are some problems with these theories. Hillary Clinton is now out of the picture, yet we see a strong persistence of evangelical support for Trump. 100 days into his presidency, 80% of church-going white evangelicals still approved of Trump. Slightly higher figure, by the way, than non-church-going evangelicals at that point. And then there's the deafening silence among so many evangelicals who did vote for Trump when it comes to criticizing him on a number of issues. And here I'm not talking about the never-Trumpers who continue to be vocal opponents of Trump, or at least many of his policies. So again, how do we make sense of this? It was in the days after the Access Hollywood tapes that it suddenly clicked for me. Most evangelicals weren't holding their noses. Trump did not represent a betrayal of evangelical values, but a fulfillment of them. And that's the case that I want to make here today. Now first, let me tell you how this epiphany came about. Around a decade ago, I was teaching history classes at Calvin College, and my students brought me a book, John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. Maybe you know it. And I read this book, and I was, first of all, disturbed, and second of all, surprised at the similarities between what I was reading and what I was teaching in some of my classes in the era of Teddy Roosevelt, early 20th century, when we see this muscular Christianity movement take hold. And so I started digging deeper, and I discovered there are actually dozens of books promoting this kind of militant masculinity, arguing that Christian men need to be aggressive, that war is essential to manhood, and that to say otherwise was to go against God, the church, and the nation. Now again, what I read disturbed me, and and I ended up setting the project aside. As a Christian scholar, frankly, I found this all rather depressing. But more importantly, I really wasn't sure if this was just a marginal movement within American Christianity, within American Protestantism, or if it was closer to the center. And so I wasn't sure if I was going to shine a light on it, if that was actually kind of a valid critique, or if I was kind of painting this brush too broadly. So, and at that point, I had also stumbled across another really interesting project. My first book is looking at the history of Christian feminism and particularly focusing on progressive Methodist women in that movement. And I had my eye on Hillary Clinton, knowing she was a progressive Methodist woman, and she just made so much sense in that light. And anyway, I started to investigate that project instead and set this other aside. Fast forward to the fall of 2016. In the weeks after Access Hollywood, I realized Donald Trump, warts and all, is very close to the masculine ideal that evangelicals have been peddling for the last 2 decades at least. And so I wrote a little article saying as much, which I published the week of the inauguration. Here's how I put it. The truth is, many evangelicals long ago replaced the suffering servant of Christ with an image that more closely resembles Donald Trump than many would care to admit. They've traded a faith that privileges humility and elevates the least of these for one that derides gentleness as the province of wusses. Having replaced the Jesus of the Gospels with an idol of machismo, it's no wonder many have come to think of Trump himself as the nation's savior. Indeed, white evangelical support for Trump can be seen as the culmination of a decades-long embrace of militant masculinity, a masculinity that has enshrined patriarchal authority, condoned a callous display of power at home and abroad, and functioned as a linchpin in the political and social worldviews of conservative white evangelicals. In the end, many evangelicals did not vote for Trump despite their beliefs, but because of them. So yes, I didn't pull many punches there. And as Tom said, it went viral. And I received a number of letters from evangelical men themselves. And I was expecting more of a backlash, and I was surprised that so many evangelical men wrote me to say, thank you. Thank you for helping me see. And those letters persuaded me to write this book. Thanks to the election of Donald Trump, at least my question of margins versus mainstream had been answered. So let me take a step back now and show you how I came to this rather provocative thesis. Now, I'm a historian, not a journalist, not a political scientist, so I'm going to take you back in time, back to the 1950s. Now, the 50s were a critical decade for understanding some of the key pieces that are going to come together in later years. So when you think of 1950s America, what comes to mind? Perhaps Leave It to Beaver, the traditional family. How about this? Cold War America, duck and cover drills, remember those? Now, as we'll see, these things are actually pretty closely connected. But first, what were evangelicals doing during this time? The traditional narrative states that evangelicals were thoroughly humiliated during the debacle of the Scopes trial in the 1920s. And so they kind of scurried away, and we forgot about them and kind of thought they didn't exist, we meaning the rest of American culture. They didn't exactly disappear. In fact, they were busy developing vibrant institutions and a thriving subculture. Although there was and historians, by the way, have somewhat revised this narrative. So again, there was a strength to evangelical culture, and they certainly didn't feel like they had retreated. But they did retreat from many of the mainline denominations, at least from the leadership there. And although there was a strand of separatism within fundamentalism, they weren't entirely politically disengaged. In fact, many conservative Christians in the 1950s enthusiastically embraced Cold War politics. Men like Billy James Hargis and Billy Graham, and a host of lesser-known conservative Christian leaders, raised the alarm of the global communist threat. Now, there were many things that attracted conservative Christians to Cold War politics. It was stark good versus evil. Communists, after all, were anti-American, anti-God, and they threatened God-given rights and the integrity of the family. And this is where the two images of the 1950s come together. The nuclear family, if you will, that was so celebrated in the 1950s with the male breadwinner and female homemaker, was seen as a bulwark against communism and as under threat from communism. According to Cold War ideology, women and children needed protection, and America needed strong men to provide for and protect its women and children, and by extension, the nation. Now, evangelical Christians embraced this view of the world, but they were not alone. Conservatives, liberals, Catholics, Protestants, they were all on board, really, and this is why we call this the Cold War consensus. Okay. But then, the 1960s happened, and this whole stable framework started to come undone. We have the Civil Rights Movement. Civil rights movement challenges the notion, at least for white middle-class Americans, that America was unequivocally good. Right? Other Americans knew that already, but it challenged this kind of stable notion of good versus bad. Feminism disrupted the nuclear family ideal. There are many different strands that came together to bring about the feminist movement. Working class women were fighting for their rights. Women in the civil rights movement and the New Left were also working for women's rights. But also these homemakers, right? These women who moved to the suburbs, who were living that nuclear family ideal. Some of these women were actually very fulfilled in that life, but not all women were. And along comes a woman named Betty Friedan, and she writes this book, The Feminine Mystique, and she names the problem that has no name, and millions of women realized that they were not alone in their dissatisfaction with this limited role. And then, perhaps most significantly, Vietnam. Like civil rights at home, Vietnam challenged the notion of American moral supremacy and American military supremacy. So how do evangelicals respond in this moment? Well, we know that most white evangelicals oppose civil rights. Right? They opposed Martin Luther King Jr., claimed that he was part of a communist plot. They also established their own segregated schools, whites-only schools, to oppose federally mandated desegregation. And some of their earliest political mobilization was to defend their right to do so. They opposed feminism. Now, this was before abortion really crystallized as the key issue for evangelicals. In the first years after Roe v. Wade, there was actually a variety of views within the evangelical Christian community about abortion, whether it was wrong or not. But initially, they rallied in opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. To evangelicals, the ERA challenged the very foundation of the conservative Christian worldview, the idea that gender was a sacred, God-given certainty in an uncertain, fluctuating world. Opposition to the ERA quickly emerged as a key plank in their family values platform. Finally, they became very pro-Vietnam War and pro-military. And this is a change. In the 1940s and 1950s, evangelicals had often looked askance at the military. That was a place where young men were likely to become corrupted. But as Anne Loveland has argued, evangelicals who supported US military action in Vietnam came to hold the military itself in high and often uncritical esteem. Now realize that for evangelicals, these issues are all intertwined. Civil rights, was it a communist agenda? It certainly was big government interference. ERA was not just a gender issue, it was a national security issue. And if you go back in that time, this comes up over and over again. The ERA would destroy women's femininity by forcing them to be like men, competitive and career-driven and sexually promiscuous, and most alarmingly, by forcing them to take up arms in military combat. The ERA then would not only masculinize women, but it would also remove from men their time-honored obligations of provision and protection, rendering American defenses vulnerable. And Vietnam was not just a foreign policy issue, it was a masculinity problem. Just look at those hippies, anti-war protesters, young men sporting long hair, flowered shirts, dodging the draft, shunning authority, shirking their duty to protect America from the threat of global communism. And clearly, the failure of American soldiers to defeat a ragtag enemy suggested serious problems with American manhood. A strong military was necessary to ward off the communist peril, and strong men were essential to a strong military. Despite their best efforts to oppose these changes, evangelicals seemed to be losing. And this is the context for their mobilization, political mobilization in the 1970s. So becoming politically active was not entirely new for many evangelicals, but it was more urgent. And more importantly, it was increasingly out of step with other cultural trends. And so these issues became increasingly central to their identity. Evangelicals emerged as an organized political force in the late 70s, but these pieces are really coming together earlier, and in places where you might not expect to find them or think to look. So let's take a look at James Dobson. Now, Dobson has a lot to say about gender. But of course, he first became famous with his 1970 book, Dare to Discipline. How many of you are familiar with Dobson? Maybe raised your children with the help of Dobson, or those who are a little younger were raised with the help of Dobson, right? Now, initially, I thought I can just skip over that 70 book, 1970, Dare to Discipline. That was the book that kind of built his platform, but it was really in later books that he started talking about gender. And so I did skip it, until finally I thought I should probably read that, and it was really interesting what I found. He doesn't talk much about politics or about gender, but it's very much a book written for its time. It's a book against the permissive child rearing in the 1960s that gave us hippies, anti-war protesters, that led to the mess of the 1960s. If only parents in the 50s had spanked their children, we wouldn't be in this mess today, or back then. And so it was really, really interesting to read that. And he also did suggest that the number of women working outside of the home didn't help matters. Okay, but in 1975, this is when he really starts talking more about gender. He starts to articulate his gender ideology. Men and women differed biochemically, anatomically, and emotionally, to wit. Men like to hunt and fish and hike in the wilderness. Women prefer to stay at home and wait for them. More significantly, men derive self-esteem from being respected. Women feel worthy when they are loved. Now, in 1975, he focused more on women and the problem of feminism. 5 years later, in 1980, Dobson focuses his attention more on the problem with men. He blamed feminists for calling into question everything traditionally masculine, for tampering with the time-honored roles of protector and protected, and for denigrating masculine leadership as macho. He saw this as a crisis of gender but also as a threat to national security. For the sake of the nation, a call to arms was needed, a reassertion of the Judeo-Christian concept of masculinity in the face of feminists' concerted attack on maleness. To fight back, Dobson founds Focus on the Family in 1977, and in 1981 he establishes its overtly political arm, the Family Research Council. And these will be key organizations in the religious right and important sources of evangelical masculinity. Another important figure to consider is Jerry Falwell. Falwell founded the Moral Majority in 1979. Now, interestingly, back in 1965, he had preached against Christian political engagement. Now, you have to understand the context was quite different. He was preaching against civil rights pastors who were involved in politics. But by the 1970s, he had completely changed his tune, repudiating his earlier message as false prophecy. In fact, by 1980, he was calling for civil disobedience if Congress passed legislation to open the military draft to women. Christian civilization was at stake. He called for Christians to fight a holy war, to resist feminism, abortion on demand, social worker intervention in the family, the abandonment of Taiwan, IRS interference with Christian schools, rampant homosexuality, and the like. Now, these things, he insisted, had corrupted the moral fiber of the country and destroyed its will to resist communism. He sent polls to his followers with questions like, do you approve of the ratification of the ERA, which could well lead to homosexual marriages, unisexual bathrooms, and, of course, the mandatory drafting of women for military combat? You can imagine how his followers responded. Now, Falwell's rhetoric was imbued with militarism. The local church is an organized army equipped for battle. The Sunday school is the attacking squad. He also portrayed Christ in supermasculine terms. He did not like portrayals of Christ as delicate, with long flowing hair, long robes. Christ wasn't effeminate, he insisted. The man who lived on this earth was a man with muscles. Christ was a he-man. Falwell came out in full support of Reagan in 1980, and evangelicals followed suit, supporting Reagan, the cold warrior cowboy president, over Carter, a born-again evangelical himself, but one who did not share their understanding of family values or American militarism. It's in the 1980s that all of these strands come together. Aligned with the Republican Party, evangelicals become fierce advocates of the US military. And again, this is something new. Jerry Falwell and James Dobson played key roles in this alliance, as did Phyllis Schlafly and other folks like Beverly and Tim LaHaye. Now, in their ministries, Falwell and Dobson regularly featured military leaders, invoking fears of American military decline. And they also provided literature that the military used in training its soldiers. Dobson's video, Where's Dad, for example, was used extensively in soldier training. And it was used, according to one military general, because the readiness of our army is directly related to the strength of our families. The stronger the family, the stronger the army, because strong families improve our combat readiness. Also, at this time, evangelical organizations like the Family Research Council, Focus on the Family Citizen, and Exodus International provided materials regularly to the military to decry the dangers of gays in the military. And so in the 1980s, we see a powerful, interconnected framework tying together family values, traditional sexuality and gender roles. By the way, always be suspicious of that term traditional, but more on that later. Masculinity and militarism, and an aggressive Cold War foreign policy. Just all comes together seamlessly. Now, in the words of Andrew Bacevich, what this means is that by assuming the role of church militant, conservative Protestants abandoned their previous skepticism about the military and the morality of force. In doing so, militant evangelicals imparted religious sanction to the militarization of US policy and helped imbue the resulting military activism with an aura of moral legitimacy. The result was ironic, he suggests. In the developed world's most devoutly Christian country, Christian witness against war and against the dangers of militarism became less effective than in countries thoroughly and probably irreversibly secularized. But by the end of the 1980s, this whole framework is starting to unravel. The fall of the Soviet Union and the abrupt end of the Cold War changed everything in some ways, right? The enemy, the long, dependable enemy, just dissolved almost overnight, it seemed. Economic conditions, meanwhile, were making it increasingly difficult for men to fulfill their roles as providers, to be the sole breadwinner. It just wasn't possible for so many American families. Also, a growing acceptance of feminism in society at large meant that evangelicals experienced the New World Order as more than a little disorderly. At this time, then, they identified a renewed crisis of masculinity, and they responded by launching the wildly popular Promise Keepers movement. Some of you may remember that. So in 1990, Promise Keepers starts up. Very early on, it's promoted by none other than James Dobson. The movement quickly takes hold, and at its height in 1997, Promise Keepers drew more than 800,000 men to Washington, D.C. for a national rally. Now, this was the first time that evangelical masculinity received sustained attention from those outside the fold. Some feminists critiqued the movement as hopelessly retrograde, but it was in fact more nuanced than many of its critics recognized. Reflecting the unsettled times, Promise Keepers called for a new Christian masculinity, an alternative, both to the softer, modern version that they found lacking, but also to the macho version that they feared had become hopelessly outmoded. Their solution? The archetype of the tender warrior. Now, interestingly, and I don't think coincidentally, this is the moment in the evangelical men's movement where there's an intentional pursuit of racial reconciliation. So when you step back from the militarism and bring in space for tenderness, that's where you also see this reach for a more diverse movement. Authors like Steve Farrer, Gordon Dalby, and Stu Weber, white evangelical men, pioneered this tender warrior motif. Significantly, all three looked to Vietnam for the source of masculine identity. In Point Man in 1990, Farrer compared a father's task of protecting his sons from feminization to that of a point man leading his troops through the dangers of Vietnam. In 1993's Tender Warrior, Weber, a former Green Beret, opened with a vivid scene depicting the terrors of Vietnam and explained how God designed men to be providers, protectors, and warriors. And in Healing the Masculine Soul in 1998, Dalby, the son of a naval officer, admitted to having neglected the image of the war hero as his blueprint for manhood. What had he done instead? He joined the Peace Corps. He became a supporter of feminism, civil rights, and the anti-war movement. But only later did he come to conclude that manhood requires the warrior. Now, these books helped popularize an increasingly militaristic model of masculinity for hundreds of thousands of men, if not millions. They were read by men's church groups, youth groups, college students, by men awakened by Promise Keepers to rethink what it meant to be a man. But again, they promoted this kind of precarious balance between toughness and tenderness. However, with a morally challenged Democratic President Bill Clinton in office, a president who was sending the military on emasculating peacekeeping missions, and with debates raging about women in combat and gays in the military, the crisis of manhood only deepened. By the end of the 1990s, we see a return to a more macho, militaristic masculinity in a slate of new books on evangelical masculinity. Focusing on how to raise properly masculine sons in a feminized culture, these books abandon any lip service to tenderness and instead champion an unabashedly aggressive, testosterone-driven masculinity. In Raising a Modern-Day Knight, published in 1997 by Dobson's Focus on the Family, Robert Lewis offered a detailed guide to help boys attain a biblically grounded manhood in a culture where men were being stripped of their maleness by a modern, secular, feminist culture. Turning to the Age of Knights, a time rife with powerful symbols of virile manhood, Lewis advised staging elaborate manhood ceremonies involving expensive steak dinners and commemorated by symbols of great value such as a Bible, a shotgun, and a plaque. In 2001, Dobson himself joined the growing outcry against a war against boys in America. In his Bringing Up Boys, he again criticized a small but noisy band of feminists who attacked the very essence of Christianity, or of masculinity. He derided feminists and other social liberals who wanted to make boys more like girls and men more like women, feminized, emasculated, and wimpified. Bringing Up Boys found a receptive audience, quickly selling over 1 million copies. Also in 2001, Douglas Wilson's Future Men insisted that boys must be raised to be warriors. Central to Wilson's definition of masculinity, these books are all about definitions and blueprints, right? It's very clear. Central to his definition of masculinity was the concept of dominion. Like Adam, all men were created to exercise dominion over the earth. To this end, it was absolutely essential for boys to play with wooden swords and plastic guns, and young boys should obviously be trained in the use of real firearms. Indeed, Wilson called for a theology of fist fighting. Perhaps the most influential evangelical book to appear in 2001 was John Eldredge's Wild at Heart. Amplifying themes articulated by earlier authors, Eldredge insisted that the difference between men and women resided at the level of the soul. And masculinity, according to Eldredge, was thoroughly militaristic. God created men to long for a battle to fight, an adventure to live, and a beauty to rescue. Women's role was a passive one. Women yearned to be fought for. They were feminine to the core, more seductive than fierce. But society offered a very confusing message to men. Having spent the last 30 years redefining masculinity into something more sensitive, safe, manageable, and, well, feminine, it now berates men for not being men. A crisis of masculinity, Eldredge wrote, pervaded both church and society because a warrior culture, a place for men to learn to fight like men, no longer existed. If we believe that man is made in the image of God, Eldredge wrote, then we must remember that the Lord is a warrior. Aggression was part of the masculine design. Men were hardwired for it. Attempts to pacify men only emasculated them. If you want a safer, quieter animal, there's an easy solution: castrate him. Yes, a man is a dangerous thing, he wrote, but the very strength that made men dangerous also made them heroes. Only months after Wild at Heart debuted, terrorists struck the United States. Almost overnight, Eldredge's call for manly heroes developed a deep and widespread cultural resonance. It quickly sold over 4 million copies. The moral certitudes of the war on terror framed by an evangelical president, George W. Bush, abruptly replaced the post-Cold War malaise. Once again, America needed strong, heroic men to defend the country at home and abroad. Evangelicals, many of whom had never strayed from Cold War gender constructions, stood at the ready to address these new conditions. Perhaps Steve Farrer put it best in his 2005 book, King Me. When those two planes hit the Twin Towers on September 11, what we suddenly needed were masculine men. Feminized men don't walk into burning buildings, but masculine men do. That's why God created men to be masculine. In no uncertain terms, he repudiated the earlier tender warrior motif that he had helped create. The trend today is to major on the tender and minor on the warrior. But in the trenches, you don't want tenderness. Dobson, too, did his part to connect the dots after 9/11, characterizing Islamic fundamentalism as one of the most serious threats to American families, and explaining that the security of our homeland and the welfare of our children are, after all, family values. In subsequent years, dozens of books were published promoting a militant Christian masculinity representing these very same motifs, and I've read dozens of these books. There are devotionals. There's a devotional based on the TV show 24. There are devotionals based on military combat directives. There are so many similar stories in these books. Frankly, if one of them were turned in by a student, I'd run a plagiarism check. I mean, it's the same cast of characters, the same heroes. John Wayne, World War II soldiers, William Wallace / Mel Gibson, they're kind of the same guy. But most especially, the favorite hero that they write about is Teddy Roosevelt. This literature has permeated evangelical popular culture. Briefly then, why does this matter? First off, and something that I'll not speak to at length today, abuse. In the last couple of decades, attention has been drawn to cases of sexual abuse within the evangelical subculture. When I went back to this project last fall, I started to follow up on what some of my guys had been up to in the ensuing years. And I was surprised to find that a number of them were implicated directly or indirectly in sexual abuse scandals, either directly or often indirectly as advocates for perpetrators. Also, I think it's worth reflecting, and this is what I do in my larger book project, in the last 2 decades, a lot of attention has also been given to sexual abuse in the military. Now, if we remember this very close relationship between evangelicals and the military, I think that's something that we need to engage as well. But it also matters because American militarism on its current scale is unimaginable without the support of evangelicals. Attention to evangelicals in politics is nothing new, but for a long time, that attention focused primarily on domestic issues. But it's critical that we understand that family values and aggressive foreign policy go hand in hand. In recent years, political scientists have been exploring exactly how people formulate their positions on foreign policy issues. They have found that public attitudes are often shaped by overarching attitude structures or purposive belief systems that guide their thinking when it comes to an array of issues. And they've discovered that religion plays a formative role in shaping these orientations. I believe that the literature on evangelical masculinity can help us understand in more precise terms exactly how religion shapes evangelical views on foreign policy. Now, the direct influence of religious and political leaders plays a role, but this is not primarily a top-down phenomenon. Evangelicals are receptive to particular views on foreign policy because of a coherent worldview that is promoted and disseminated in churches, in small groups, schools, and families. a worldview that at first glance may seem to have very little to do with foreign policy. At the heart of this worldview are gender roles, ideas about what God created men and women to do and to be. For evangelicals, gender is critical to the belief systems that support militarism and aggressive foreign policy. As Cynthia Enlow argues, militarism is never natural or monolithic, and it cannot survive without constant tending, coaxing, and manipulating. And ideas of masculinity are at the heart of this process. It's not difficult to imagine how evangelicals, steeped in a literature claiming that men were created in the image of a warrior God, how they might be receptive to sentiments like those expressed by the late Jerry Falwell in his 2004 sermon, God is pro-war. In fact, surveys demonstrate that traditionalist evangelicals are more likely than other Americans to approve of U.S. engagement in preemptive war, to favor defense spending, to disavow multilateral engagements, to hold anti-Islamic views, to support military action against terrorism, and to condone torture. I believe that this brand of militant masculinity also helps explain the lack of outrage on the part of many evangelicals when it comes to Trump's character issues. After all, evangelicals had long preached the value of testosterone and reminded one another that boys will be boys, that wildness and aggression is part of God's plan for men. During the 2016 campaign, Dobson himself, one of Trump's most influential evangelical supporters, urged fellow Christians to cut him some slack on the moral issues. More tellingly, the Reverend Robert Jeffress, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, explained his endorsement of the candidate in this way: I want the meanest, toughest son of a you-know-what I can find in that role, and I think that's where many evangelicals are. I don't agree with Jeffress on much, but I fear his assessment of evangelicalism may be correct. And if it is, what is at issue is far greater than evangelical support for Trump. As Andrew Basevich explained back in 2005, what is most striking about the most powerful man in the world is not the power that he wields. It is how constrained he and his lieutenants are by forces that lie beyond their grasp and perhaps their understanding. Rather than bending history to their will, presidents and those around them are much more likely to dance to history's tune. The problem of American militarism, and Basevich believes it is a problem, is bigger than a particular president or single administration. And for this reason, simply getting rid of that president will not make that problem go away. To pretend otherwise serves no purpose. Now, when I published my initial essay on evangelical masculinity, militarism, and Trump, I said I received a number of letters from evangelical men. One of them particularly has stayed with me. He wrote about his discomfort being part of the Promise Keepers movement, reading some of this literature, but he couldn't really put his finger on what was wrong with it. And so he brought this to his pastor, and his pastor rebuffed him, saying, what can possibly be wrong about books that bring men to Christ? And he wrote to me in this letter, until I read this essay, I never once stopped to ask, which Christ? And that's where I'll leave you today. Thank you.